The earliest memory I have is of my mother's hands around my throat. I was 3 years old, and she was kneeling over my bed with her nightgown twisted around her knees, and her breath smelled of the cooking wine she kept hidden in the laundry cupboard. I didn't cry. I just looked up at her with the trusting eyes of a child who didn't yet understand that the person who was supposed to protect him was the person he needed protection from. She let go before I lost consciousness and stumbled back against the wall and stared at her own hands like they belonged to someone else. When I was 5, she started putting rat poison in my porridge. She'd store it in while the oats were still steaming and set the bowl in front of me and watch with her arms crossed and her face completely still. I didn't know what she was doing at first. I just knew the porridge tasted bitter and made my stomach cramp, and sometimes I'd vomit for hours afterward. When the school nurse finally noticed how thin I was and asked about the bruises on my arms, my mother told her I was a sickly child with a weak constitution. The nurse nodded and wrote something in her file, and never asked again. By the time I was 7, I'd learned to survive. I learned to smell the chemicals before I tasted them. I learned which food she was most likely to tamper with and which she left alone. I learned to steal food from the school cafeteria and hide it under my mattress for the nights when she locked me in my room without dinner. But more than that, I learned to fight back. The first time I retaliated was after she'd beaten me with a wooden spoon until the spoon broke against my shoulder blade. I waited until she was asleep, and then I took her wedding photograph, the one she kept on the mantel, the one where she was young and beautiful and standing beside a man whose face I'd never seen. I burned it in the kitchen sink and left the ashes in a neat pile on her pillow. She didn't beat me again for a week. After that, it became a ritual between us. She'd hurt me and I'd destroy something she loved. She'd lock me in the cellar and I'd release the latch on the chicken coop so the foxes could get in. She'd refuse to feed me, and I'd wait until the household was asleep and empty the entire pantry onto the floor. She'd scream at me that I was a demon, and I'd scream back that she'd created me.
We were locked in a silent war beneath the gray skies of the Yorkshire moors. My grandmother lived in a narrow stone cottage at the bottom of the hill, a 15-minute walk from our farmhouse. She was the only person who ever tended to my injuries. She never asked where the bruises came from or why there were burn marks on my forearms. She just filled a basin with warm water and tore clean strips from an old bedsheet and wrapped my wounds with the practiced hands of someone who'd done it many times before. She spoke very little. She had the same gray eyes as my mother, but where my mother's eyes burned with something sharp and desperate, my grandmother's were flat and distant, like a lake that had frozen over years ago and never thawed. Sometimes after she'd patch me up, she'd make me a cup of tea with too much milk and too much sugar, and I'd sit at her wooden table and drink it while she stood by the window, staring out at the moors. She never sat with me. She never touched me beyond what was necessary to tend my wounds. She was always just slightly turned away, as if looking at me directly would cost her something she wasn't willing to pay. One winter evening when I was 10, I asked her, "Grandmother, why does my mother hate me so much?" Her hands stopped stirring the teapot. The silence stretched between us like a wound that wouldn't close. "Your mother had a difficult life," she said finally. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have." She poured the tea and the steam rose between us like a veil, and I didn't ask again. Everything changed when my youngest sister was born. I was 12 years old and Clara was a tiny red-faced creature with a shock of dark hair and a cry that could pierce through stone walls. I was fascinated by her. She was so small and so helpless, and she looked at me without any of the suspicion or fear that I was used to seeing in other people's eyes. One afternoon, while my mother was hanging laundry in the garden, I crept into Clara's room. She was awake and fussing in her crib, and I reached down to pick her up.
I just wanted to hold her. I just wanted to feel what it was like to hold something that didn't recoil from my touch. My hands were clumsy, and I fumbled with the blanket, and Clara started to cry. My mother appeared in the doorway like a ghost summoned by the sound. She crossed the room in 3 strides and seized me by the collar of my shirt and threw me against the wall so hard my teeth rattled. Her face was inches from mine, and her eyes were wild with a terror I'd never seen before. "What were you going to do to her?" Her voice was a ragged hiss. "I know what you are. You carry his filth in your blood. Every time I look at you, I see his face." She let go of my collar and stepped back. Her hands were shaking. She looked at me the way you might look at a rabid dog that had wandered into a nursery. "Why couldn't you have died instead of him?" She took Clara and left the room, and I slid down the wall and sat on the floor with my head spinning and the back of my skull throbbing where it had hit the plaster. I had always known my father was dead. My mother had told me he died before I was born, and I never questioned it. I'd invented a dozen different stories about who he might have been. A soldier killed in the Falklands,
a fisherman lost at sea, a factory worker crushed in an accident. But the way my mother had looked at me just now told me the truth was something much worse. I walked through the cold November rain to my grandmother's cottage. She opened the door and saw the bruise already blooming on the back of my head and the blood dried in my hair. And she didn't look surprised.
She just stepped aside and let me in. She filled the basin with warm water and took down her shears and carefully cut away the hair that was matted with blood. Her hands were steady, but there was something different in her movements tonight, a tension that hadn't been there before. "Grandmother," I said quietly as she pressed a cloth against the wound on my scalp, "tell me the truth. What did my father do?" Her hands stopped moving. For a long moment, she was completely still. Then she pulled her hands away from me and wiped them on her apron, as if touching me had left something on her skin that needed to be removed. She didn't answer, and the refusal itself was the answer. I saw it in the way she stepped back from the chair, in the way she crossed her arms over her chest, in the way her eyes flicked to the door and then back to me and then away. The same way my mother looked at me, the same revulsion, barely concealed beneath a thin layer of obligation. I understood then. My father hadn't just died. He had done something monstrous, and I was the living proof of it. I pushed back from the table and walked out into the rain. My grandmother didn't call after me. She just let me go. I walked across the moors in the dark with the rain plastering my clothes to my skin and the wind cutting through me like a blade.
I walked until I reached the old railway bridge that spanned the river at the edge of our property. I stood on the bridge, looking down at the black water churning below. The current was fast and deep, and the surface reflected nothing but the empty sky. I had spent my entire childhood believing I was a victim, that my mother was cruel and unfair, and that I deserved better. But what if I didn't? What if the evil really was in my blood? What if everything she'd done to me, she'd done because she was trying to protect herself and her other children from something she genuinely believed was dangerous? I thought about the look on my grandmother's face when she'd pulled her hands away from me. I thought about the way my mother had said, "his filth." I thought about Clara and how terrified my mother had been when she'd seen me standing over her crib. Maybe she was right to be afraid. Maybe I was exactly what she thought I was. I didn't know how long I stood on that bridge. The rain stopped and the clouds parted and the moon came out pale and cold. By the time I climbed down, my hands were blue with cold and my teeth were chattering. But I had made a decision. This year, I would give my mother a gift she truly wanted. I would remove the stain from her life. I would disappear.
My mother seemed unsettled by the change at first, but she adapted quickly. She'd always preferred me silent. I started preparing things without consciously understanding why. I sorted my meager belongings into a small canvas bag. I taught my brother Thomas how to feed the chickens properly so he wouldn't get pecked. I showed him how to bank the fire in the stove so the house would stay warm through the night. He looked at me with confusion in his round blue eyes, but he accepted my help the way children accept anything that's given to them. I tucked a small, smooth stone I'd found in the river into Clara's crib. It was gray and perfectly oval and had been worn smooth by years of current. I didn't believe in luck or blessings, but I wanted her to have something from me that wasn't tainted. I wanted her to know someday that her brother had loved her, even if he'd never been able to show it. And I started giving my wages to my grandmother. I'd been working odd jobs at the neighboring farm since I was old enough to hold a bucket. I collected eggs and mucked stalls and helped with the lambing in spring. The farmers paid me in coins, and I'd always hidden them under my mattress to buy food when my mother locked the pantry. Now I gave every penny to my grandmother. For the household, I said. She took the money without comment. She didn't ask why I was suddenly contributing. She just added the coins to the jar on her mantle and went back to her knitting. The morning I'd chosen was cold and gray, with frost on the hedgerows and mist hanging low over the fields. I walked to the old stone barn at the edge of the north pasture. It had been abandoned for years, the roof half collapsed, the walls covered in ivy. No one would find me there until it was too late. I carried a length of rope I'd taken from the equipment shed. I climbed to the loft and tied the rope to one of the remaining beams. I tested the knot 3 times, making sure it would hold. My hands were trembling, but not from fear, from relief. I had one foot on the edge of the loft when I heard a small voice behind me. "Jack, what are you doing?" It was Thomas. He was 6 years old, with his blonde hair sticking up in all directions and his Wellington boots on the wrong feet. He'd followed me across the pasture without me hearing him. He stood in the doorway of the barn, his breath misting in the cold air. "Go back to the house, Thomas."
Why are you holding that rope? I said, go back! He took a step forward instead. His lower lip was trembling. Are you going to do something bad? You're scaring me. I looked at him. He was so small and so trusting, and he looked nothing like me. He looked like our mother. He was the child she had wanted. Thomas, I said, my voice cracking like old plaster, please just turn around and forget you ever saw me. I can't, he whispered, and then he bolted toward the ladder. He climbed with the reckless speed of a child who didn't understand danger. He wasn't looking at the rungs. He was looking at me with his eyes wide and terrified, and something else, something that looked like love. Before I could react, he was on the loft floor, reaching for me with his small, cold hands. I lurched backward to keep him away from me. My heel slipped on the rotting floorboards, and I fell. I hit the packed earth below with a sound like a sack of potatoes dropping from a lorry. The impact drove every particle of air from my lungs. I lay there, gasping, staring up at the rafters and the broken rope dangling above me. Thomas scrambled down the ladder so fast he nearly fell himself. He threw himself on top of me, his small fists pounding against my chest. Jack! 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 I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I just lay there with my little brother sobbing on top of me and the gray morning light filtering through the holes in the roof. I couldn't even die properly. Thomas ran back to the house screaming for help. I heard his footsteps squelching across the muddy pasture, and I closed my eyes and waited. When I opened them again, my mother was standing over me. Her face was chalk white, and her hands were shaking at her sides. She looked at the rope, still knotted to the beam. She looked at me, lying in the dirt with Thomas's tear tracks still wet on my shirt. And something in her expression cracked. It wasn't the disgust I was used to. It wasn't the cold hatred. It was something rawer and more terrible. It was guilt. She didn't say a single word. She just grabbed Thomas by the hand and pulled him back toward the house, leaving me alone in the barn with the broken rope and the dust and the knowledge that even my near death couldn't make her see me as human. That night, I lay in my narrow bed in the attic room listening to the wind rattle the window panes. The house was silent, except for the usual creaks and groans of old timber settling. And then I heard it. Crying. Not the crying of a child. It was the raw, broken sobbing of an adult who had been holding something inside for so long it had calcified. It was my mother. I lay very still and listened to her weep through the thin walls. The sound was worse than any beating she'd ever given me. It was the sound of someone who was in pain so deep it had no bottom. I pressed my pillow over my head and tried not to hear it. The next morning, I woke before dawn and packed a canvas bag, 2 changes of clothes, a pocket knife my grandmother had given me for my 9th birthday, a photograph of the moors that I'd torn from an old calendar, 63 pounds I'd saved for my farm work and hidden in a sock beneath a loose floorboard. I didn't say goodbye to anyone except Clara. I stood beside her crib in the quiet kitchen while everyone else was still sleeping. She was lying on her back with her tiny fists curled beside her ears. The river stone I'd placed there weeks before was still tucked in the corner of her blanket. I reached down and touched her cheek one last time. Be good, I whispered. Be brave. Don't let anyone tell you what you're worth. Then I walked out the back door and started down the long, muddy lane toward the main road. I was 12 years old. I had 63 pounds in my pocket, and I had no idea where I was going. But I knew I couldn't stay. The first lorry that stopped was driven by a man named George, who was hauling wool to the mills in Bradford. He looked at me, standing on the side of the road with my canvas bag and my worn-out boots, and he didn't ask any questions. He just jerked his thumb toward the passenger seat and said, "Get in then." I rode with him for 4 hours through the gray winter landscape. He shared his sandwiches with me and told me about his daughter, who was about my age. When we reached Bradford, he pointed me toward a shelter where I could sleep and pressed a 5-pound note into my hand. "Don't spend it on drink," he said, "and don't let anyone tell you you're not worth saving." I never saw him again. Bradford was overwhelming. The noise, the crowds, the sheer density of buildings. I'd never been in a city before. I walked through the streets with my collar turned up against the cold and tried to look like I belonged somewhere. I found work at a textile mill, a vast, clattering building filled with looms that shook the floor. The foreman, a thin man with nicotine-stained fingers, looked me up and down.
"How old are you?" 14. I lied.
He knew I was lying, but the mill needed workers, and I was willing to work for less than the adults. He handed me a broom and told me to keep the floors clean. I worked at the mill for 6 months. I slept in a boarding house that catered to itinerant workers, a narrow room with a single window and a bed that smelled of mildew. I ate in the canteen where the food was cheap and filling, and I kept my head down and didn't make friends. When the mill closed, I moved on. I hitchhiked south through the Midlands, working odd jobs at farms and construction sites. I learned to lay bricks and mix mortar and read blueprints. I grew taller and leaner, and my hands became rough with calluses. By 15, I'd crossed into Wales. I found work at a sheep farm in the Brecon Beacons, run by a woman named Meredith. Meredith was in her 60s, with a weathered face and sharp blue eyes, and she had no patience for self-pity. She'd lost her husband to a mining accident and her son to the army, and she ran the farm alone with the help of 2 border collies and whatever drifters washed up looking for work. She saw the scars on my back one day when I was changing shirts in the barn. They were old scars, faded to silver but unmistakable. Belt buckle marks mostly, with a few cigarette burns scattered among them. She looked at them for a long moment. Then she handed me a cup of tea and said, "You pull your weight here, and you'll have a bed and 3 meals, and nobody will raise a hand at you. You cause trouble, and you're gone. Fair enough?" Fair enough. I worked for Meredith for 5 years. I learned how to manage a flock, how to treat foot rot and fly strike, how to lamb a ewe in the middle of a freezing night. I learned to read the weather and the shape of the clouds and the behavior of the sheep. I learned to mend dry stone walls and repair fencing and drive a tractor. And for the first time in my life, I felt something approaching safety. Meredith never asked about my past. She never pushed me to talk about the scars. She just accepted me the way she accepted the weather and the seasons and the hard realities of farm life. But there was a problem that followed me everywhere. My face. Every time I caught my reflection in a puddle or a window, I saw him. I didn't know exactly what my father had looked like, but I knew I carried his features. The heavy brow, the square jaw, the deep-set eyes. It was his face that had made my mother flinch every time she looked at me. It was his face that had condemned me before I'd drawn my first breath. I started growing my hair long so it fell across my forehead. I kept my head down when I met new people. I avoided mirrors. But it wasn't enough. When I was 17, a ram charged me during the breeding season. He was a big Suffolk with curling horns and a temperament that had always been unpredictable. I was moving him from one pen to another when something spooked him. He lowered his head and charged, and his horn caught me across the left side of my face. I felt the impact, and then I was on the ground with blood pouring into my mouth, and Meredith was shouting for someone to call an ambulance. The hospital in Brecon stitched me up as best they could, but the scar was severe.
When the bandages came off 2 weeks later, I asked the nurse for a mirror. The face that looked back at me was different. A thick, jagged scar ran from my left temple across my cheek and down to the corner of my jaw. The symmetry was gone. The heavy brow was distorted. The square jaw was broken by the uneven line of tissue. I looked at my reflection and felt something unexpected. Relief. I didn't look like him anymore. I looked like myself. Meredith died when I was 22. It was pneumonia, the doctor said. She'd been fighting a cough for weeks and refused to see anyone about it. By the time she collapsed in the lambing shed, it had settled deep in her lungs and there was nothing they could do. I buried her on a hill overlooking the farm, with the Brecon Beacons rising green and gray in the distance. I didn't know what to say, so I just stood there in the rain with the vicar and the 2 border collies and the wind cutting through my coat. She left me the farm. The solicitor read the will in a small office in Brecon with the rain streaking down the windows. Meredith had no living relatives. She'd written me into her will 5 years before she died. "Jack, I know you came to me as a stray, and I know you'll never stop being one. But this farm needs someone who understands it. Take care of the sheep. Take care of the dogs. Take care of yourself." I folded the letter and put it in my pocket, then I walked out into the rain and I stood on the hill above the farmhouse and I cried for the first time since I was a child. By 25, I'd built the farm into a successful operation. I expanded the flock and diversified into cattle. I hired a farmhand named Reese who was young and eager and reminded me of myself at that age. I built a reputation for producing quality breeding stock, and I sold lambs and calves to farms across the region. I kept to myself mostly. I didn't date, I didn't socialize. I went to the pub in the village occasionally and nursed a single pint in the corner while the locals talked about rugby and politics.
They accepted me as a quiet outsider, someone who'd appeared from nowhere and built something solid. They didn't pry. I thought the past was behind me. I thought I'd buried it under years of hard work and silence. Then, one gray afternoon in November, a car pulled up the farm lane, and a young woman stepped out. She was tall, with dark hair pulled back in a braid. She had the same gray eyes as my mother. She was maybe 17 years old. She looked around the farmyard with an expression of nervous determination. When she saw me walking out of the barn, her hand went to her throat, where something small and gray hung on a leather cord. I stopped dead. "Jack?" she said, her voice uncertain. "I'm Clara, your sister."
I couldn't speak. The last time I'd seen her, she was an infant in a crib with my river stone tucked beside her blanket. Now she was nearly grown, a young woman with her mother's eyes and her own fierce resolve. She pulled an envelope from her coat pocket and held it out to me. "Grandmother died last month," she said. "She wanted you to have this. I've been looking for you for 6 months. I hired a private investigator with the money you left us." I took the envelope with hands that felt like they belonged to someone else. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in my grandmother's cramped handwriting. "Jack, if you're reading this, I'm dead, and it's about time. I need to tell you something before I go. The night your mother tried to smother you was not the first time she tried to kill you. She tried 3 times before you turned 5. I stopped her each time. Not because I loved you, but because I was afraid of what would happen to her if she succeeded. I was a coward. I watched her starve you and beat you and lock you in the cold for 12 years. I tended your wounds and gave you tea and pretended I was doing enough. I was not doing enough. I was never doing enough. I told myself you were cursed. I told myself you were the living reminder of evil. I told myself that ignoring you was the kindest thing I could do. I was wrong about all of it. You saved Thomas from drowning in the sheep dip when you were 10. I saw it happen. I watched you pull him out of the freezing water and pound on his back until he coughed up the muck. I never told your mother. I should have told her. Maybe it would have changed something. You are not your father's blood. You are your own blood, and the man you've become is better than any man in this family has ever been. I've enclosed the deed to my cottage and the land around it. It's yours. Sell it or keep it or burn it to the ground. I don't care. Just know that I'm sorry and that you deserved better. Grandmother. I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. Clara was watching me, her expression cautious. Mom wants to see you, she said quietly. She's dying. The doctors say it's her liver. She's got maybe a month. She asked me to find you. She said she needs to say something. I looked out across the farm at the sheep grazing on the hillside. The Brecon beacons rose gray and green in the distance. I had built a life here, a good life. But the past had found me anyway. I'll come, I said. The drive back to Yorkshire took 6 hours. We didn't talk much at first. Clara told me about her life, about her plans to study agriculture at university, about the boy she was seeing. She told me she'd grown up knowing she had a brother who'd left when she was a baby. Thomas told me about you, she said. He told me you saved his life when he was little. He said he'd never forgotten it. He said you were the bravest person he'd ever known. I didn't know what to say to that. When we pulled up to the farmhouse, I barely recognized it. The roof was sagging. The garden was overgrown with brambles. The barn where I'd fallen from the loft was completely collapsed. A young man I didn't recognize was standing in the doorway. It took me a moment to realize it was Thomas. He was 19 years old now, tall and broad, with the same blonde hair and blue eyes. He walked toward the car, and when I stepped out, he stopped. Jack? Thomas? He pulled me into a rough embrace. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick. "I was just a kid. I didn't understand what she was doing to you. I just thought you were angry all the time. I didn't know." "It's not your fault," I said. "You were 6. How could you have known?" He pulled back and wiped his eyes. "She's inside. She's been waiting." I walked into the house. The kitchen was the same as I remembered, the same wooden table where I'd sat with my grandmother, the same iron stove where my mother had once thrown me against the wall.
everything was smaller and shabbier and older. My mother was in the back bedroom, propped up on pillows. When I walked through the door, she turned her head and looked at me. Time had ravaged her. Her hair was completely gray. Her skin was yellowed and stretched tight over her bones. Her eyes were sunken. But when she saw me standing in the doorway, something shifted in her expression. "Jack," she breathed. I stayed in the doorway. "Mom."
She closed her eyes. "I don't deserve to be called that." "No," I said. "You don't." She was quiet for a long moment. "I know what I did to you. I know there aren't words big enough to undo any of it." "I'm not here for an apology," I said. "Then why did you come?" "Because Clara asked me to, and because I needed to see you one more time." She opened her eyes and looked at me again. Her gaze traced the scar on my face. "What happened to your face?" "A ram. It was the best thing that ever happened to me. It made me stop looking like him." She flinched as if I'd slapped her. "I was so afraid of you," she said. "Every time I saw your face, I was back in that room. I was 19 years old and he was holding me down. I couldn't separate you from him. I tried so hard, but I couldn't." "I know," I said. "I understand now. I didn't then."
"But I do now." She reached out a trembling hand toward me. I came closer and sat in the chair beside her bed. But I didn't take her hand. "Thomas told me about the sheep dip," she said. "He told me you pulled him out and saved his life. You were 10 years old. Why didn't you tell me?" "Would you have believed me?" "No," she whispered. "I wouldn't have." I reached into my jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. I placed it on the nightstand. "What's this?" "Money. From grandmother's land. I sold the cottage." She stared at the envelope. "I can't take your money, Jack." "It's not for you. Half of it's for Thomas. The other half is for Clara. There's enough for both of them to go to university." She looked at me with something in her eyes that I'd never seen before. "Thank you," she said, "for taking care of them. Even after everything I did to you, you still took care of my children." I stood up. "I'm leaving now. I'm not coming back. I don't hate you anymore. I let that go years ago, but you and I can't be in each other's lives. Some things are too broken to fix. That's not your fault, and it's not mine. It's just the truth." She was crying now, tears running down her hollow cheeks. "Jack, please, just stay for a little while. Let me look at you." I paused at the door. I turned back and let her look. For a full minute, I stood there in the doorway of that dim room, letting her see the man I'd become. The scarred face, the broad shoulders, the hands that had helped birth lambs and build walls and create something good out of nothing. The son who had survived despite everything she'd done to destroy him. Then, I walked out of the room. Clara was waiting on the porch. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I'm okay. Will I see you again?" I looked at her. She was 17 years old with her whole life ahead of her. "Yeah," I said. "I'd like that." She hugged me fiercely. Then she let go. "Thank you for coming," she said. "And thank you for the river stone. I didn't know what it meant when I was little, but I know now. It was the only thing I had from you." I walked down the porch steps and toward my truck. The sky was gray, and the moors stretched dark and empty to the horizon. I drove away and didn't look back. 2 years later, I stood on the hill above the farm in Wales, watching the sunset behind the beacons. Reese had taken over most of the day-to-day operations. Thomas had finished his first year of agricultural college and had come to work with us during the summers. Clara called me every Sunday evening from university. She was studying to be a veterinarian. My mother died the year before. I didn't attend the funeral, but I did scatter a handful of Welsh earth into the wind from the highest point on the farm. Not for her, for the boy I'd been. The boy who'd survived the beatings and the poison and the pillow in the dark. The boy who'd stood on a railway bridge at 12 years old and thought the world would be better off without him. I buried him that day. The scar on my face had faded to a pale silver line. When people asked about it, I told them a ram had charged me during the breeding season. I never mentioned my father. I never mentioned my mother. I never mentioned the cold farmhouse on the Yorkshire moors or the abandoned barn or the rope I tied to the beam. Not because I was ashamed, but because those things belonged to the boy I'd buried. I wasn't that boy anymore. I was Jack. Just Jack. And my life was finally my own.